Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're now on lecture 6 for this term. And today, I'm going to be talking to you about the fact that China in the Northern Song decided that they wanted to resume the kind of translation and contact with India that had existed during the Han Dynasty. So that's what we are going to explore today, is that a new era of translation was started in the 10th century. And we need to consider what that did and how it was done. The Northern Song, which was formed in about 960, started new translations in 983. Very shortly after the dynasty was formed, the emperor wanted to have prestige. And one of the things that he said was, we have allowed the old trade routes through Central Asia to deteriorate. And we are no longer sending pilgrims through those routes. But those were golden days for our people. So let's go back and do it that way again. So he sent out word to the monasteries in China that now's the time for monks of good health and intelligence to once again travel what we now call the Silk Road to India for the purpose of finding manuscripts of Buddhist texts that have not yet been brought to China. And these should be brought back, and we will translate them, make printing blocks, add them to the Caibao print edition, and enter a new era of learning about Buddhism in China. It was certainly an ambitious goal on the part of the emperor. We're not sure exactly how many monks answered his call. Some people think there may have been hundreds. We just don't know. I can't tell you precisely. But they did follow, as far as we can tell, the old inland route. They went out through Lanzhou, Baidonghuang, Turfan, and Kashgar, down through the Indus into India. It cannot have been an easy journey in those days. Gone were the great cities that had lined that route before. They had to make their way long distances between cities because the trade route had simply not existed as a large going concern for a long time. But they made it, at least some of them did. And when they crossed over the mountains and went into India, it was as if China and India had once again been separated for a period of time. During the Tang Dynasty, the break between these two great cultures had finally been fully in place once again. So when the monks began to arrive in India, the vision which the emperor had back in China of we're going to be like the old days, we're going back to that golden period. Problem was India and the subcontinent had not been doing nothing. They were being active. Things had changed. The India, which the monks who came from the northern Sung would find, was not the India which the pilgrims, the early pilgrims, going all the way back to the time when missionaries came in the Han Dynasty, it was not the same place. First of all, from the 4th to the 6th century, northern India had been mainly run by the Gupta Empire, separated from the south. There was no unified kingdom like that of King Ashoka of the past. And even when Devapala and set up a real empire and reached out toward Central Asia also again in the 9th century, it was not an empire that covered the whole of the subcontinent either. So we are, like with the monks who arrive there, they're going to find a very different India than they think if they are basing their idea of India on what was present in the past. What had happened in India was that Buddhism was disappearing. Sometimes I've suggested that maybe it wasn't so much that it was disappearing as it was becoming invisible, that it was simply being absorbed into the larger Hindu environment, Brahmanic environment, and people didn't see the difference between their Brahmanic tradition and the Buddhist. Vishnu would appear as the Buddha. So when the Buddha appeared, was it Vaishnavism or was it Buddhism? Only one really identifiable Buddhist kingdom had remained, and it was in power. So that when the northern Sung monks came, they at least found the Pala dynasty. The Pala dynasty, which stretched across the northern part of the subcontinent, would have picked up the travelers as they came down the Indus, and they would then have found a Buddhist community. But once again, it would have been a Buddhist community that was unlike anything that had happened in the past. The primary tradition of Indian Buddhism is now tantric. Pala dynasty was fully supportive of this tantric tradition, this esoteric tradition, and it was producing texts which belonged to that tradition. Prajnaparamita was still a very important text, but the tantric tradition had absorbed a lot of the Prajnaparamita material, and there were Prajnaparamita texts written for the tantric community, if you will. So that's what the search for the Chinese search for the newest thing in Buddhist teaching. I'm not sure that they were ready for what they found. I think it must have been very hard for those monks, because when they got there, it was very difficult to find new material. A lot of what they found were tantric dharani texts, very short texts, many of them only a few pages long, a few leaves. So they had to find what they could find and bring it back to China. And once they brought it back, then it had to be translated into Chinese. This was the hope of the Northern Song. Now, part of this desire to create a healthy Chinese influence in Central Asia was being directed toward the fact that there were empires to the north of the Song. These were pastoral, some nomadic in origin. These empires to the north were quite powerful. They occupied a lot of land. You couldn't get to Japan or Korea by land without going through the new empires. And even if you went toward the Taklamakan, as you can see, you were sharing the boundaries with those empires on the way out there. So the Song was working hard at trying to maintain itself. They were in lots of ways a great dynasty. They introduced all sorts of standards into China. Standard texts, as we've said, weights, measures. And at the same time, they were faced with enormous pressures on them. But the monks went. They overcame all these things, and when they got to India, as I've said, they came upon the Pala dynasty. By the time they got there, Buddhism was only still being practiced in the Bengal region, as you can see from the map here, the old homeland of Buddhism, the Ganges Basin. And the Buddhism which was being practiced, as I've said, was more tantric. The question which always arises is, who produced these canonic texts, these Sanskrit manuscripts? Who made the redactions? What community in the subcontinent, in India, were the authors and the redactors for this? We assume that there had to be a group of learned people to produce a long sutra text or a commentary or a compilation of material. And there were such communities still available. In the Bengal, there were places like the great monastic complex at Nalanda, sometimes called the world's first university. Nalanda now is dominated by the ruins of the stupa that's said to have housed the relics of the famous Shariputra. Hundreds of monks were still being trained in a place like Nalanda. And it was from a place like this that if new texts were to come forward or new commentaries, it would probably have to have come from places like this. Bikamasila was another one of these monastic universities. It must have housed hundreds of monks. It was still functioning when those Northern Sung people arrived. So these large monastic groups in the Bengal had become, in one sense, the last home of active Buddhist sutra production and commentaries and study. We don't exactly know how much was found throughout the subcontinent, but certainly it does not seem to have equaled what we find in these Bengal great monasteries. That's why when these monasteries were under attack and the first Islamic invaders came into those regions, and they suffered from this invasion, they lost their audience, they lost their power. And it's said that Buddhism disappeared and that the monks from these places fled to Tibet, and there's where it was kept alive. So in a way, the kind of Buddhism which would have been taken from these places to Tibet is the kind of Buddhism which the monks from the Northern Sung would have come in contact with. So they made their way back home. They picked up a great and famous monk who went with them. We'll talk about him in a minute. A new translation started in 983, and they lasted till 1090. So we had another period in Chinese Buddhist life which was filled with this process of translation. Well, one translator who was the most famous and did the most work was Dhanapala. And Dhanapala was a native of Odiyana, in Kashmir, near Gilgit, from his homeland. So that he was someone not from the central Pala dynasty as such, but was someone who lived in the mountain areas leading up river, the Indus, towards Central Asia. So I feel that when these monks began to travel and they came in contact with him, it was a lucky find for them. They found a very learned monk, and he was somebody who was on the road, so to speak, to China. And he traveled back with them, and he became one of the great translators of the Northern Sung. He was especially involved, again, with tantric material. Many of his texts contained dharanis. It's interesting that of all the several hundred texts which were brought back and translated during the Northern Song. They are attributed to 4 translators. I can't believe that that only means that 3 Chinese went to India and brought back 1 Northern Indian translator with them. I suspect that when these names were given as the translators, it may have referred to those monks who were operating translation teams, because they were putting out a lot of work for this few people. Who they were is very difficult to figure out. For example, many texts in their colophons will say it was translated by Tianzi Tai. Then some say Fa Xian. There is some evidence that Tianzi Tai changed his name to Fa Xian. If that's so, then that takes it down to even fewer people. Fa Tian, who is another one of these Chinese. So I feel that these names are, we're not sure of the people behind them. We're not sure what their task was. Dhanapala would undoubtedly have been head of some kind of translation team. He knew Sanskrit. He would have been a great asset. How many of the other monks that were listed, how many of them were knowledgeable of Sanskrit and to the same degree? We don't know. Someday, I think somebody will really research these groups, and we will begin to see more about how the Buddha's message from India was still coming into China at this very late date. So translations were made, as I've said, from 983 to 1090. And it's interesting that we know they were made into printing blocks, and the rubbings from those printing blocks were sent to Korea. The Koreans had already carved printing blocks for the Kaibao edition that we talked about earlier in the class. And now here came a new bunch of Indian translated text in block print edition from the Northern Song. They seem to have come in 2 gifts from the Northern Song to the Korean court. The first one, we would say, has the K number of text 1088 through 1256. So you can see that there were almost 200 texts translated, put onto block prints, printed, sent to Korea. Fortunately for us, the Koreans didn't commingle. They placed them on their library shelf exactly as they received them. And so we can spot that these things came in 2 different gifts, because the later numbers, K, are K 1408 and 1497, another 90 texts, but they're placed after another group of texts that were a miscellaneous group of translations from the Tang Dynasty. So the Koreans were receiving from China these materials of the Northern Sung, and they were coming in, they came in 2 packages, I think, and that's what we have. The first one dates the translations that were done up to 999, and the second one for the translations that were done after 1000. So what was it in these texts? What message was being given to the Chinese? And the big issue for us is that these Northern Sung translations are very seldom studied. People who have looked at them are disdainful of them in many ways and said these translations are not very good. They're nothing like the translations of Xuanzang in the Great Tang Dynasty. Whether they're talking about the lack of translation ability or whether the texts which these monks were bringing back from India had been undergone changes in India which do not get reflected in China before, and therefore are seen as errors, is hard to tell. But these texts that came, from my experience, have been very little studied in China. And Tantra has been very little studied in China compared to Tibet. So if you want to know what was being brought into the Northern Sung environment, the place to look is probably into the Tibetan texts that are involved at the same period. Going through some of these tantric texts that came, however, were textual references to non-perception or perception, non-perception. And Anupala's texts tell us that there were 4 things, 4 levels of development for a tantric practitioner. One was to fully understand perception. And the second was to understand non-perception. And then finally, a higher state was to understand the non-perception of perception. And if that's not difficult, how about the 4th stage, the perception of non-perception? That this is a teaching which I think has its basis in Prajnaparamita, the doctrines of emptiness, thusness, was all taken, I think, from Prajnaparamita text. The Pala dynasty was a great supporter of Prajnaparamita text. They made and had new editions of the texts that belonged to this school. Atisha, who traveled from Bengal all the way to Sumatra to study Tantra, tells us that he was taught first the Prajnaparamita, and then he was taught the Dharanis. So we see that these texts that were being brought back in the Northern Sung are reflective of this stage, particularly being dominated by the Pala, for the Tantric tradition, which found its doctrinal basis in Prajnaparamita in terms of perception and non-perception, and based on their practice of the use of dharanis or mantras, that is, words which were given special usage in the rituals. The main message that was brought to China is that the appearance of a duality happens when thusness, that is, endlessness, is not recognized. And they focused on the appearance of duality. They said appearance does not equal existence. Just because something appears to our perception, it does not say that it has existence, like a mirage of out in the desert. Looks like a lake reflecting the mountains around it. It's an appearance. It's a very real appearance, but it's not an existence. There is no water. There is no reflection in the water. It is the mirage of the light rays being bent by the heat of the sand and air at that time. So this had been brought, these Northern Sung people had brought to China a whole new set of texts. I can't say that they were highly influential in China, but I can say with, and I really appreciated it when Alex Amos in our class brought forth the idea that these dharanis, these tantric materials, show up in all kinds of places in Chinese culture, even if they don't have an established school that thrived or a whole series of texts for everybody to read. What happened is that these texts have influence in China, which reflects itself, I think, primarily in the idea of mind only, that perception and non-perception refer us to the fact that any appearance, any duality is a product of and a construct of our own mental abilities. So that's the story of a whole new era of Chinese translations. And along with them came what we can call compilations. The Chinese, while they weren't making translations anymore, even before the Northern Sung, they had begun themselves to write commentaries, to make compilations. That is, people would go through all the sutras and pick out very important passages and weave them together and make a compilation. And these compilations became very popular, more popular than the sutras themselves sometimes. So that the story of Buddhism and the way in which Buddhism was being embraced by the later Chinese at a time when Buddhism in India is beginning to fade and disappear is the story of people once again traveling the Silk Road looking for Buddhist texts. But in the long run, even though the Sung emperor wanted it to be reestablish a landline to India, when we look at the tantric materials that were flowing in through Guangzhou and the seaport to the south, the many translations had been made by someone like Amoghavajra. I have to say that the emperor's attempt to establish the land route was turning his back, in a sense, on the major route at that time, which was still bringing in Buddhist influences coming from South and Southeast Asia by the seaports. But I do feel that what the Northern Sung tried to do deserves our attention, and it deserves to be understood. And I think we need to understand how people were using materials which were quite difficult. And these many, many small texts of dhananis, mantras, spells, if you will, all of these were coming into the Chinese sphere. And some of them would show up in later times in the rituals and in the chants that people were making. We're still trying to comprehend how the message of Buddhism came to China and how it became the Chinese Buddhist canon. The Northern Sung certainly made a major new addition to that canon. Thank you.